Senator McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr President. Before I ask my question, I'd like to acknowledge the Northern Territory Housing Minister, Jerry McCarthy, in the audience here today. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Senator Scullion. The Minister's Remote Housing Review found that since the National Partnership Agreement on Remote Indigenous Housing commenced in 2008, overcrowding among Indigenous households has fallen from 52.1% to 37.4%, a reduction of 28%. And the review also found that Queensland, WA and South Australia exceeded their targets for Indigenous housing refurbishments by 23%, 35% and 60%, respectively. Minister, given the findings of your own remote housing review, why are you withdrawing Indigenous housing assistance to those states?
Senator Scullion.
Well, perhaps that's one of the challenges with question time. You're stuck with the same question. I've provided the answer to that before in my first answer to Senator Dodson. I'm not moving away from any of those things. But what we need to do is if we're going to stop overcrowding, having a refurbishment of a house doesn't provide an additional bedroom or more houses. The only things that provides that is a rebuild or a new house. So can I make it absolutely clear, we're not moving away from this, but we want to hold the states and territories to account. It's okay to be able to, and in the first 5 years of the program, under things like CHIP, it was an absolute outrage with jurisdictions taking 15%, not putting a single cent into that process. So yes, we have used our independent review into housing to look very carefully at those processes. But for a state to say, oh, we've exceeded our number, I'll tell you what that means. That means I didn't build a house because it was too hard, I took the money for that and I painted up a couple of others. And I can give you heaps of examples about the disingenuous approach from the remainder of the jurisdictions of all political persuasions, Senator. And so I can promise you we are engaging, but we're ensuring that the states actually have funds on the table rather than us just putting money into their budgets and the outcomes turning up in a whole variety of places, but not necessarily in remote communities, and actually putting towards reducing the number, which means investing in houses and in rebuilds. But you know, the refurbishments are a very small part of this, and they are far easier to do than actually going out and actually building a new house or rebuilding a house on a new site.
Senator McCarthy, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Given that in Queensland alone the NPRH has supported 2,640 jobs over the past 10 years and currently supports a growing number of Indigenous businesses along with over 850 Indigenous apprentices and trainees, why are you withdrawing Indigenous housing support as a result of these?
Senator Scullion.
Well, thanks very much, Mr President. As I can just clarify again, I am not withdrawing from this. I am not withdrawing from the process. I am not withdrawing from the process. Well, in the Northern Territory, on a bilateral, we have indicated that we are going to be putting in 120. We've undertaken the Northern Territory, because that's the only bilateral that's been finished, that we would be putting in 120 million a year, and they would be matching it, the Northern Territory. So that is the way it's going. Now we're looking to the states and territories whom I suspect actually withdrew. So on the places where we're requiring Napari to be built, there was actual act and a decision by those jurisdictions to not spend a cent of the funds that the Commonwealth invest, and they should invest, in remote communities. Now we've yet to find out that that's the case. I hope I'm wrong, but I've seen absolutely no evidence to demonstrate they have taken any other course.
Order, Senator Scullion. Senator McCarthy, final supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. The Remote Housing Review states, and I quote, "This achievement of increasing housing supply and amenity and the resulting benefits of reduced overcrowding should be celebrated." End of quote. Why, Minister, are you celebrating this achievement and yet walking away from funding remote housing?
Senator Scullion.
Well, we're certainly not walking away from funding remote housing. And can I say there is another issue about the jurisdiction. They are now being required to put this in a fund that is managed between the state, the Commonwealth and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, yes, that hasn't been accepted well. We're just supposed to put it straight into the coffers. In the Northern Territory context, Senator, you'll be pleased to know the Northern Land Council, the Central Land Council, a representative from the Northern Territory Government and the Commonwealth Government will manage that fund to ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, instead of for 10 years being given lip service, get real jobs. So instead of being saying, oh, I know somebody who owns an Indigenous business, we will be buying bricks and mortar. We'll be ensuring that Indigenous businesses are out there building those homes, because that's how we have to value add it. So it's no point just saying, oh, we're doing things with Aboriginal people instead of to them. You've got to actually do that. And this is another example of how this government has delivered on that promise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Brockman. Senator McCarthy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. There is a fog of confusion around the way the Commonwealth is handling negotiations on housing with the states and territory governments, and I'll tell you why. In the Northern Territory, Minister Scullion stood up at a community in Arnhem Land and commended the Northern Territory government for putting forward $1.1 billion in terms of its housing, and it agreed to continue the partnership of $1.1 billion over 10 years. So there is confusion here when the Prime Minister says on Friday that that's not the case. And I certainly call on the Minister and the Prime Minister to be much more clearer in the deliberations and negotiations that you are having, because you're sending very, very confusing signals. Today we have heard all the words about improving outcomes for First Nations people, about closing the gap, about aspirations to improve the life outcomes for us, our children, our families, and I don't doubt the Prime Minister's intentions when he says he wants to see more and do more, see real improvements. And you can't get much more real and solid than bricks and mortar housing. Good quality housing underpins all of the closing the gap targets in health, education and employment, as well as community safety. Good housing is the key to strengthening communities, particularly remote communities, and improving lives. This government knows this. In fact, it says this in its own Closing the Gap report. Yet this government has refused to clarify if they actually have any real commitment to improving the enormous need for remote housing needs. The Indigenous Affairs Minister, Senator Scullion, refused to clarify what, if any, plans he has to extend or replace the 10-year $5.4 billion National Partnership Agreements on Remote Housing, NAPARIA, which expires in June 2018. Senator Scullion was given every opportunity today to explain what plans he has to put on the table, his positive plans for improving the dire, desperate need for remote Indigenous housing, and he couldn't do it. Senator Scullion could not say how many new houses his government would commit to building. He could not say how many families would benefit from new or improved housing. He could not say how the federal government plans to meet the additional 5,500 homes estimated by his own review to be required by 2028 to reduce levels of overcrowding in remote areas. Despite the 10-year plan expiring in 4 months and the budget being handed down in 3 months, the minister cannot give any indication of how his government is going to tackle the enormous need for housing in remote areas. And this is what failure sounds like. But it's not Senator Scullion who lives with this failure. It's the family in Alice Springs town camp sharing one bathroom with 20 other people because extended family members have no housing. It's an elderly woman sleeping outside in the front yard in 45-degree heat because her home doesn't have air conditioning. It's the elderly disabled man living on an outstation whose toilet hasn't worked for weeks, being given a rubber plunger and told to fix it himself. Senator Scullion mentioned housing refurbishments and seemed to think they were not needed and a waste of money. The Remote Housing Review said the evidence is clear that houses deteriorate quickly without ongoing maintenance and repairs. Having invested $5.4 million into this program, you would think that Senator Scullion would see it as a priority for the government to protect its investment and increase the longevity of houses by maintaining the housing already delivered. Keeping housing maintained and functional plays a huge role in overcoming housing shortages and overcrowding. And just to put on the record another finding from the review, and I quote, "Under the Community Housing and Infrastructure Program, CHIP, the Fixing Houses for Better Health surveys found that only 9% of household faults are caused by tenants. The misconception that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families cause the majority of damage and deterioration to remote Indigenous housing needs to be corrected. Absolutely. A focus on tenant education is important, but so too is delivering good, quality and appropriate housing that meets building standards." But housing isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's also about jobs and economies, especially in remote areas. So come on, Minister, come on, Prime Minister, get on with the job and support our housing.
Thank you, Senator McCarthy. Your time has expired.